Welcome, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to the Center for American Progress. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Stephanie Johnson. I am the Associate Campaign Director for K-12 Education Policy here at CAP. We are thrilled that you have joined us for this event co-hosted by the Learning Policy Institute and Learning Forward. The day after the White House ceremony honoring the National and State Teachers of the Year, I had the pleasure of interviewing the 2017 National Teacher of the Year, Sydney Chafee. Sydney discussed her school, her students, and her mission as an educator. And when I asked her about Trump's budget, she said to me rather diplomatically, and I quote, "I know that there are proposed cuts to Title II Part A. If we want our students to succeed, we have to support our teachers in being as strong as they can. The way that teachers get better is through collaborating and learning from one another. If we value that, then we have to make sure there are resources available for them to do that." Exactly. Well said, I thought to myself. So let's break that down. 1, if we want students to succeed, we must support teachers. To support teachers, they need to collaborate and learn from one another. And finally, if teachers are to collaborate and learn from one another, then resources must be made available for them to do that. So yes, investing in professional learning for teachers is an investment in students. National leaders cannot simultaneously call for improving learning and achievement for students while stripping away the resources that make it possible for teachers to improve their own learning. But that's exactly what President Trump and Secretary DeVos are proposing with their 2018 fiscal year budget. Demand more from students and teachers while providing them less support and less resources. Budgets are a reflection of values. And this budget from Trump and DeVos makes it clear that they do not value or perhaps even understand how critical teachers are to ensuring student success. And yet, is there any phrase more often quoted in this space than teachers are the #1 in-school factor affecting student achievement? I don't think so. My point is, there is a federal interest in meaningfully supporting the teacher workforce, and we must continue to make that clear to this administration. And as we do so, we must come to the table with evidence of what works. So today, we are delighted to have the Learning Policy Institute here with us to share with us their findings from their new report on effective professional learning. But before they present those findings, I would like to introduce Stephanie Hirsch, the Executive Director of Learning Forward, our other co-host for this event. Learning Forward standards of professional learning respond to new research and findings on what makes professional learning effective in leading to improved results for students. Stephanie, an educator herself, is a champion of teachers and the teaching profession. She began her career as a secondary teacher and later served as a school district administrator in the Richardson Independent School District in Texas. Stephanie presents, writes, and consults on Learning Forward's behalf across North America. She advises policymakers and practitioners at all levels on improving student achievement and educator effectiveness through implementation of high-quality systems of professional learning. Please join me in welcoming Stephanie.
Stephanie, you said that beautifully. I'm trying to think of what else I can add at the moment to start this incredible conversation off this morning. And it's wonderful to see that so many people turned out for a conversation about professional learning. I want to also thank the Center for American Progress and the Learning Policy Institute for this opportunity to focus in depth on the support our educators need most. So let me try and just reiterate some of the important statements that Stephanie made. I guess it's the two Stephanies supporting each other this morning. Each year we expect and want more for our students. Mastery of state-adopted career and college-ready standards, demonstration of deeper learning, and evidence of post-graduation success are just a few of those expectations. And time again, it's been shown that teaching and leadership are the #1 and #2 factors in determining whether these outcomes will be met. Research also shows that the effective teacher and principal preparation and development are keys to ensuring great teaching and leading for every day for every student. These investments ensure that teachers and principals have the knowledge and skills as well as the support necessary to improve student achievement and at the same time reduce the costs associated with low student performance, including grade retention, remediation, and higher dropout rates. Under ESSA, Title II, Part A provides funds that are designated to the states and districts to assist with recruiting, preparing, supporting, and developing the high-quality teachers and principals our students need most. This funding is critical to states and local efforts to implement evidence-based strategies to improve instruction, turn around schools, close equity gaps, and address national teacher and principal shortages and turnover. With Title II funding in jeopardy, you can see why this conversation is so important today. And some of the questions that we will intend to address include, what is the role of educator quality in advancing equity for historically underserved students? What does evidence-based professional development look like? And how can states and districts ensure that the professional development provided to educators is effective in improving student outcomes and driven by student needs? I can imagine no more important conversation taking place in our nation's capital today. This conversation is about our nation's future and how our greatest resources, our children, will find a meaningful place in it. Thank you.
I'm Linda Darling-Hammond, president of the Learning Policy Institute, and I'm going to present the results of a recent study that we're releasing today with my colleagues Maria Heiler and Madeline Gardner. I also want to acknowledge the assistance we received from Danny Espinoza. Where are you, Danny? And Catherine Bradley. Where's Catherine? Thank you. It does indeed take a village to do a report like this, so we appreciate them as well. And so let's see if ta-da. This is one of those kinds of studies that, on the one hand, you say, why did you need a study to do this, right? Because, everyone should know that good professional development would make a difference for teachers learning and then students learning. And on the other hand, we have a history of challenges in professional development in this country in terms of the quality and the context within which it has evolved. That makes this new news, that in fact we did find quite a large number of rigorous studies that do show how you can engage in effective professional development. We were talking in the green room before we got out here. Many of us are former English teachers on the panel. I don't know how that quite happened, and some current ones. But all of us have had the experience of ineffective professional development as well as some effective one. The active conversation in Washington you've already heard about, that in fact the cuts to teacher development funding would zero it out entirely at the federal level. People ask, why would you spend money on that anyway? There's no evidence that it makes a difference. So this has been an active conversation. There was a report a few years ago called The Mirage, and that term refers to the idea of effective professional development. This was a study that went into 3 districts and a charter management organization looking for the outcomes of professional development and finding very few sources of evidence that it was making a difference. So this is a common view that we have experienced, and it is well grounded. When I was teaching high school English, I remember this saying, and I found it on the internet recently. When I die, I hope it is at a faculty meeting or teacher in service, because the transition from life to death would be so subtle. So, it is news that professional development can in fact be effective. We've spent the last year reviewing 35 studies that are methodologically rigorous, that met the standards that we were looking for when we did a very intensive review of the literature. It includes randomized controlled trials and quasi-experimental designs and studies that have statistical controls for comparisons that demonstrate a positive, significant link between professional development for teachers and student outcomes in the form of gains in student achievement. And then we identified the common features of the programs that were reflected in those 35 studies. And what we saw was a real paradigm change from the old model of what teachers will recognize as sit and get or drive-by professional development. Sometimes it's called spray and pray. It happens after work in an auditorium sometimes, or the cafeteria, or in some cases even stadiums have been, full of teachers getting PD. Which is somebody giving you a lecture with a PowerPoint, for a couple of hours and telling you what to do. Often one size fits all and disconnected from the classroom and students. The 7 features we identified are these: that the professional development that's effective is focused on subject matter that teachers are working in. It's content focused. Teachers are actively involved in their learning. It's collaborative in a variety of ways. It uses models and modeling of effective practices. Coaching and expert support is available. Teachers engage in reflection and feedback, and it is sustained over time. And so with that, I'm going to pass the clicker to Maddie, who's going to talk more about what, in fact, goes on in these programs.
Great, thank you, Linda, and good morning, everybody. So happy to be here with you today. So as Linda's just mentioned, the report identifies 7 features of effective professional development programs, and each of them was selected because it was very prevalent in the literature that we reviewed. So of the 35 studies that we looked at for the report, each of the features I'm about to discuss was prevalent in at least 30 of them, and a great many of the studies had all 7 components working together to support teachers. In almost every case where we didn't identify a particular element in this set of studies, it was primarily a result of the fact that they didn't necessarily offer a very high level of detail in describing the professional development, rather than the fact that we got explicit confirmation that the feature was excluded. So Appendix C of the report, for those of you with it handy on page 48, offers a little more information on this. As Linda mentioned, the first element of effective PD is a content focus. So strong professional development really emphasizes the content that teachers are teaching in their classrooms every day. A program might demonstrate this element by, for example, inviting teachers to construct lessons from a new high-quality curriculum or a unit from that same curriculum, or perhaps as teachers investigate how students learn a specific content in their subject area. And content-focused PD is also often job-embedded and specific to the actual curriculum and students that teachers work with every day. The content provides something of the what for the PD, and the remaining 6 elements really get into the how of PD. So one theme that Linda mentioned is that effective PD engages teachers in a variety of forms of active learning. And the use of this type of learning really exemplifies that paradigm shift. So rather than offering lecture-based, traditional workshop models, active learning PD engages teachers with content meaningfully through discussion, analysis, observations, and actually through practice themselves. This is also a fairly broad term that subsumes several of the other elements I'm about to discuss, including this next one, collaboration. Teaching is a collaborative endeavor, so it's not surprising that collaboration is an element of high-quality PD. And this can take many different forms, whether it's working one-on-one with a coach, in a small group, or as part of a professional learning community that extends beyond the school. We also observe that in some cases, technology can be a helpful support to ensure that all teachers are offered these opportunities for collaboration. So for example, in a remote mentoring program, technology can be a means to connect teachers and mentors who aren't physically co-located. Or in a peer-to-peer model, online forums can be an incredibly valuable means for helping teachers connect and network across great geographic distances. As with content, this often occurs in job-embedded contexts. So teachers will plan together, offer each other feedback, and problem solve. These teams are often located within schools and provide a forum to support teachers' learning as it relates to their students in classroom every day. The fourth element is models of effective practice. By providing teachers with these types of models, PD programs offer a clear vision of what best practice looks like. And there are many different ways of accomplishing this aim. So as you can see on the screen, it could be things like offering high-quality curricular resources, lesson plans, unit plans, student work, teaching cases, whether they're written or in video form, or observations of peer or master teachers. And several of the studies in the report indicate that these types of models are perhaps most supportive of student and teacher learning when they're provided alongside other supports for implementation and training rather than offered in isolation. Effective PD programs also provide coaching or other expert support to facilitate teacher learning. So these experts are typically educators themselves and lead teachers through the types of active and engaging learning experiences that we've talked about so far. They also tailor specific advice and counsel to individual teachers' needs as they work with them. So, for example, they may share specific expertise about specific subject areas or evidence-based teaching practices in individual or small group coaching. And no matter the form, this type of expert scaffolding can really help build those bridges between teachers' professional learning experiences and what they do in their classrooms every day. The next element, feedback and reflection, commonly occurs actually within the confines of coaching or small group work, though of course it's not limited to that space. Powerful teacher learning opportunities offer time for teachers to reflect on and think about and receive feedback about their practice. And while feedback and reflection are somewhat distinct practices, we combine them for the purposes of the paper because they both really work together to support teachers as they move towards the expert visions of practice that have been articulated by their professional learning experiences. And we know that all of this obviously takes some time, so effective professional development programs are sustained. Research hasn't offered us any magic number about the number of hours that teachers must participate to have PD be effective. And instead, it indicates that professional learning opportunities must allow teachers to study deeply and then apply their learning across cycles of inquiry over time. And that can be accomplished using many different structures. For example, it might start with an intensive workshop that really sets teachers up to apply new practices in their classroom, and then bring them back together to debrief, problem solve, and collaborate as they implement those practices. Or it might involve that intensive workshop and classroom work followed by coaching. In many cases, they're using all of these practices together. So to wrap up, I want to offer one example of a professional development model operating at scale that ties together all of these elements, and that's the National Writing Project. That's a national network that provides professional development to support students' writing and learning. And today I'm going to talk specifically about the College Ready Writers Program because we're lucky to have Casey Olson, a teacher leader for the program, joining us on the panel. So the College Ready Writers Program is specifically focused on training teachers to support argument writing among secondary school students, a clear content focus. And it does this using a three-part approach. First, they offer curricular resources. Second, they provide formative assessments. And of most interest for us today, they also provide extensive professional learning for their educators. As part of the program's PD, teachers engage in a number of active learning strategies, such as analyzing student writing, participating in lessons as learners themselves, and observing demonstration lessons, which is a form of modeling. Many of the activities, including co-planning and co-teaching lessons, are highly collaborative in nature, and throughout the program, teachers work with specially trained teacher mentors like Casey to discuss, reflect on, and set goals about their teaching. And the program involves 90 hours of professional development spread over 2 years, with many touch points for teachers to return to that content and apply their learning in their own classrooms over time. For those of you with the report at hand, pages 18 and 19 offer a little more information about this program, but for now I'm going to hand it off to Maria to talk a little more about the implementation side.
Thank you, Maddie, and good morning, everyone. I'm going to bring it home and talk a little bit about both school and system level conditions that can inhibit the effectiveness of well-designed professional development. So school level challenges such as inadequate resources, a lack of opportunity for implementation, and a negative school culture have shown to be obstacles to effective development. Resources include things like materials for science labs or project-based learning. No opportunity for implementation indicates a lack of dedicated time for teachers to use newly acquired knowledge. For example, in one study, a teacher received science, instruction, and pedagogy professional learning, only to have the school remove the time for science instruction from their schedule. School culture can also be a powerful obstacle to effective professional development. In another study, teachers mistrusted administration and proved resistant to the professional development. Even though it was well designed, there was a lack of trust on this teacher's part, and that impeded the professional development impact. So challenges to implementing effective PD extend beyond school and classroom. These challenges include a lack of alignment between what teachers feel they need to learn to best meet their students' needs and districts' initiatives and priorities. Likewise, there's often a disconnect between state and local policies. For example, states generally require seat time for recertification, which in turn encourages districts to organize one-off workshops that are easy to schedule and require less human and financial resources than do evidence-based approaches to PD. Related, very few states have systems in place to measure both quality as well as quantity of professional development. Without such systems in place, it's hard to adopt and implement professional learning for teachers that is evidence-based and designed to address potential obstacles. The good news is these challenges can be addressed through thoughtful policies and strategic implementation. So as mentioned, the best evidence-based design PD will fail if poorly implemented. Common obstacles to PD, such as lack of time, inadequate resources, challenging school cultures, should be anticipated and planned for during both the design and implementation phases of PD. Implementing professional development well also requires a responsiveness to the needs of educators and learners to the context in which teaching and learning takes place. In the end, well-designed and implemented professional development should be considered an essential component of a comprehensive system of teaching and learning. To ensure a coherent system that supports teachers across the entire professional continuum, professional learning should link to their experiences in professional and preparation and induction, as well as to teaching standards and evaluation. It should also bridge to leadership opportunities to ensure a comprehensive system focused on the growth and development of teachers. So, what are some areas of focus for policymakers? Policymakers could adopt standards for professional development to guide the design, evaluation, and funding of professional learning provided to educators and aligned with such elements as in a report. Policymakers and administrators could evaluate and redesign the use of time in school schedules to increase opportunities for professional learning collaboration, including participation in professional learning communities, peer coaching, and observations across classrooms and collaborative planning. States, districts, and schools could regularly conduct needs assessments using data from staff surveys to identify areas of professional learning most needed and desired by educators. State and district administrators could identify and develop expert teachers as mentors and coaches to support their particular areas of expertise for other educators. States and districts can integrate professional learning into ESSA school improvement initiatives, such as efforts to implement new learning standards, use student data to inform instruction, improve student literacy, increase student access to advanced coursework, and create a positive and inclusive learning environment. States and districts can provide technology-facilitated opportunities for professional learning and coaching using funding available under Titles 2 and 4 of ESSA to address the needs of rural communities and provide opportunities for intra-district and intra-school collaboration. And finally, policymakers can provide flexible funding and continuing education units for learning opportunities that include elements identified in this report and not just traditional workshops. You can find the full report at this URL, and there are also some available in the back. Thank you, and we look forward to engaging a conversation across the two panels, and we'll be available for questions at that time. And now I'm going to transition to introducing John Merrow, our moderator for the first panel. John Merrow began his career as an education reporter with the National Public Radio nearly 40 years ago with the weekly series Options in Education, for which he received the George Polk Award in 1982. He is currently education correspondent for PBS NewsHour and president of Learning Matters, an independent production company based in New York City. His varied reporting has continually been on the forefront of education journalism. Merrow is the only reporter to have interviewed every U.S. Secretary of Education. Merrow's work has taken him from community colleges to kindergarten classrooms, from the front lines of teacher protests to policy debates on Capitol Hill. And his new book, Addicted to Reform, a 12-step program to rescue public education, is coming out soon in August. So please help me to welcome John Merrow and the first set of panelists. Thank you, John. Here's the book. And I think you're supposed to
Guys, come on up. Good morning, everyone. I actually retired a year and a half ago, Maria, but that's okay. I did spend 41 years reporting on education, and as Linda noted, I'm one of those former English teachers. I were an English teacher, but I got fired. Professional development, something I reported on every once in a while and rarely heard good things about. So it's good to see that serious people like Linda and Stephanie and others are making a concerted effort to bring what good professional development actually looks like. I want to introduce my panel. You already know Maria and you know Stephanie. The guys, all the way over there, is Dan Weisberg, who is the chief executive, the CEO of TNTP, what used to be called the New Teacher, not anymore, just initials like, okay. Prior to becoming CEO 2 years ago, Dan was executive VP for performance management. Before that, he was vice president for policy and co-author of The Widget Effect, which I'm sure you all are familiar with. He played a big role in two other influential TNTP reports, The Irreplaceables and The Mirage that Linda referenced. Before TNTP, Dan worked as chief executive of labor policy and implementation in the New York City Department of Education, the country's largest school district by far. And he was a partner in a New York law firm. Casey Olson still is an English teacher, high school English teacher in rural Montana for 14 years, where he also leads the local union. He was a 2015 Montana Teacher of the Year finalist, serves on the College Ready Writers Program leadership team for the National Writing Project, which was referenced earlier. And he credits his own professional development experience for making him a better teacher and a stronger member of the teaching profession. So it's a good group of folks. What I'd like to do is talk with them for 40 minutes or so and then open it up to your questions if that works for you, and I'll try to keep track of time here as well. This is pretty stacked in favor of PD, but there's one skeptic up here, and maybe we should get some skepticism out there as part of the conversation. Dan, that's your job. In the Mirage, which shocked a lot of people, just to quote briefly, this is from the executive summary, we estimate the districts we studied spend an average of nearly $18,000 per teacher per year on development efforts. One district spends more on teacher development than on transportation, food, and security combined. At this rate, the 50 largest school districts in the U.S. devote at least $8 billion a year to teacher development. Furthermore, the teachers we surveyed reported spending approximately 19 full school days a year, nearly 10% of a school year, participating in development activities. After a little more than a decade in the classroom, an average teacher will have spent the equivalent of more than a full year on development. Now, those are just numbers, but your argument is that it really is not very effective. Did you hear anything this morning that makes you?
Well, so I'm the skeptic, but let me say this: I am not a skeptic when it comes to the central need for quality development and support for teachers. That remains as critical, if not more critical now than it was when we wrote the report. But I do think we need to fundamentally change the way we approach teacher development. Congratulations on the release of the report, extremely well written and thoughtful. I fear it takes us down a road we've been down before, which has not led us to providing effective support for teachers. And what I mean by that is the following. And this was true of us when I worked in the district for 6 years in New York City. Typically what you do is you identify some issue. We want to do better on early grade literacy. You come up with some shiny new program. You throw it against the wall and hope it works. You don't even look to see whether it sticks against the wall. That's typically what we do. We'll spend a lot of money on an initiative that is supposed to address a real problem, but we tend to have very, very little discipline, A, in identifying what practices we're actually trying to change or instill in teachers, and B, what effect we think that will have on teachers, and then, most importantly, we generally put no resources into actually determining whether it's having the desired effect.
But there are in this report numerous examples of PD that works. Why don't districts pay attention?
For every one of those studies, you can find another example in the graveyard of PD of well-intentioned, well-resourced initiatives, and some of them are cited in the report, I think rightly so. Michael Garrett has done a lot of work in this area that haven't worked, and that's the confounding thing. That's what confounded us when we wrote the report. Wait a minute, if you just do the right type and dosage and you have all these design elements, it should work, right? But not if you don't have the discipline on the front end to determine what it is you're trying to accomplish and then to actually measure it.
But you're saying it's not an issue of money. That's what I want to.
Not an issue of money. It very often is an issue of how you allocate the money. So that's one of the other friendly amendments I would make to the report, which has some very solid recommendations about ways we can further support teachers and have effective PD. I think we are shooting ourselves in the foot if we look at that as additive resources. Now, I bet if you're a teacher saying, where's this $18,000? I'm not seeing this, and rightly so. Well, it's embedded in a lot of places. It's embedded in, central office folks who are working hard to try to do, put on workshops for teachers. It's embedded in assistant principals who spend a lot of time trying to provide development. It's embedded in the HR department. It's embedded in the curriculum instruction department. It's embedded in a lot of places, and for most teachers, and we surveyed over 10,000 teachers for this report, what they're seeing is a bombardment from many, many different angles. Not coherent, not clear that it's responsive to any need that they have, and nobody owns it to actually say whether any of this is actually producing any progress. So before we say, let's have job-embedded coaching that is consistent with the principles in the report, and let's come up with $2 or $3 million more to do it. Let's inventory what we're doing now.
You'd argue for the equivalent of an environmental impact statement.
Yes.
Yeah, before you approve it, you got to show these are the things, and this is how we're going to get there. I'm going to give Stephanie and Maria a chance to respond, but I want to ask Casey first, because I know you're a fan of the PD that you've had through the national. But did you have ineffective? You were teaching 14 years. Tell us a little bit about other experiences you had with professional development.
Well, I would start with, I really don't disagree with anything Dan just said.
Come on now.
I've experienced bad PD in my career, and I connected with the meme that Linda shared earlier of the wishful thinking of passing away during one of those events. But I think that a lot of it comes back to, well, for my context, I teach in a very rural Montana school, and in that context, I am far away from my colleagues, from my peers. I make up half my English department, and after 2 years of teaching in that environment, of having that the PD that's thrown against the wall being heaped upon me as it falls off, I felt like I might be ready to move on, to go on to something else other than teaching. But I had the benefit of a superintendent who okayed using these title funds that we're talking about, funding my participation in a National Writing Project Institute that has, 12 years later, has led me to some really substantial growth as a professional. That has had an impact on the test scores in my classroom. So there's some really bad professional development out there. There is some really good professional development that has some really bad implementation. But there is, and I think this report speaks to it, there is a way to professionally develop, to go about professional learning in a way that has an impact on teachers and students, and especially teachers and students in a simultaneous way.
Now, you said that the PD works for you. The report calls for seven characteristics. The first one is that it be content focused, that you're one of 2 English teachers in your school, and I think you said in our conversation that the PD was more general. How does it work if it's not really about becoming a better English teacher?
Well, the benefit of the content in the benefit of the National Writing Project in providing me, specifically as an English teacher, content-specific professional development is that it comes from a source outside of my school district. It's very difficult for a small school district to provide PD that's specific to my content area in a way that is efficient and economical as far as funding is concerned. So having outside sources where my district can use these title funds to invest in me as a teacher, that's beneficial.
Would you paint a picture? Are you in a room on Skype with people from how does it work?
It's varied, and as I believe it was Madeline's slide that showed all the various ways that this can take place. It can happen in a Google Hangout, but it can also bring me together to cover that distance to a central location in Montana, and meet with other teachers in that context. But it can also look like me going to a national conference, and I bring that information back not only to my colleagues within my local National Writing Project site, but then also share that with my district. And the investment in me with title funding in my rural district can be exponential, because then when I bring that information back, it empowers me as a teacher leader to share that what I've learned with my colleagues. Often, and when it comes to writing and research and argument, as what the College Ready Writers Program specifically is focused on, that covers multiple content areas, and that allows me to come back in my district, share that information with my colleagues, collaborate with my colleagues, and put that to use. And it's exponential because that initial investment of those title funds in me then plays out and has a recursive value that I keep bringing information back.
So the form of your PD varied. Form
Yes.
followed function. And so how important was the leadership? That's not one of the 7, but I have a hunch if you looked for ineffective PD, you might find that there were really terrific school superintendents or leaders. But how critical was it for you?
I think one characteristic among many of great professional development is that it creates teacher leaders.
Oh, but your leadership that led to your superintendent apparently looked at the pile on the floor and said
100%.
it wasn't working.
Right. That's the support from administration is really critical in targeting the use of those funds. I can't allocate those funds myself. So having a supportive administration is absolutely critical.
Stephanie and Maria, you heard Dan and his skepticism. I want to give you an opportunity to defend PD generally. He was only looking at 4 districts.
No, I mean, I accept his skepticism. I think we all have a responsibility to be healthy skeptics around professional learning because we have lots of instances where it hasn't worked for teachers. Let me clarify 4 points, though. One is, I don't think we're demanding more dollars. What we're asking is, let's not take away the dollars that the districts need right now under Title II. One of the resources that absolutely we do need more of is time, and time does translate into dollars. But even at 10% a year, teachers don't have the same amount of time that their colleagues in the higher performing countries have in order to collaborate and learn from each other and to polish and plan great lessons.
So to have effective PD, we have to reduce what's called the teaching load?
I think we can think of different ways to organize time in schools.
Is that a yes?
So that, yes, definite yes, okay. I also think one of the big challenges is the mental model that a lot of people who aren't invested in this work on a daily basis carry around about professional development. They still see it as that adult pull-out program. And instead, really powerful professional learning exists when teachers learn in teams, when they collaboratively problem solve, when they write new lessons, when they develop assessments, when they examine student work. And even teachers, when asked on surveys about their professional development, frequently don't relate that kind of development to professional development. And states don't recognize it, and they don't give credit under relicensure, which was mentioned in the report. And then the fourth thing I would say is no one wants bad PD. And absolutely, the question that you were getting at with Chris just a minute ago is that it really takes leadership within schools and systems that to define a learning culture where the kind of support that Chris got can occur. And principals and superintendents aren't born with that knowledge. They need professional learning as well in order to be able to design that system that helps teachers grow.
Now, Casey, did you get
Casey, I'm
credit
sorry.
for the work you did? I mean, Stephanie identified a key issue. Do teachers actually get credit for doing this stuff? And if they get it for sitting in a drive-by, but they don't get it for the intense thing you do, that works against you. Do you get any kind of credit for doing that?
That comes back to that support from administration. And I have been blessed with administrative support.
So yes, you get credit?
Up front, so yes, I get credit. But then also the results of the investment leads to more credit and support in professional leave and support like that.
Maria, how critical is that issue of credit? I mean, teachers, if they're going to get credit for sitting in an auditorium, but they wouldn't get credit if they spend time after school working together, teachers are pretty busy.
Yes, teachers are very busy, and the topic of continuing education units is very important. And I don't think it's that folks are not getting continuing education credits for the more effective-based PD. It's more that it's more convenient and it's easier and more cost-effective to do the type of one-day workshops or the disconnected PD. So districts tend to lean towards those types of PD. As
Cost-effective, but not necessarily effective.
Correct. That's correct. Yeah. And so just to follow up on what Stephanie was saying, and actually relating to Dan, we're looking at what works. There's no argument that there's PD out there that doesn't work. So the report was really to shed light on best practices, what's working, and to discover what's common across these programs that are working. And we're hoping to help policymakers support better policies And around that, it's a comprehensive system of teaching and learning. So this idea that PD doesn't solve everything, so you do need leadership support and high quality leadership. And we have a brief on leadership, I think that's available here, that talks about the importance of leadership in supporting a common vision of teaching and learning. And so this idea of a comprehensive vision that a district has of teaching and learning is where a school and teachers can think about what students need in that particular context. They can talk about what teachers need to best support those students' lead, and then design professional learning along these elements to then support teachers' learning for kids' development.
I'm curious, are there school districts or states even that you would say, okay, there, go look there. You'll see an awful lot of really good
I
PD.
was there last week. I was in Long Beach in California,
Okay.
and I was very impressed. They have 5 understandings in Long Beach Unified School District. And the district has these understandings that are focused on what students need in the district. And the schools across Long Beach, if you're familiar with the district, are very different, and they have very different needs. So each school focuses on their student population, what their kids need, and then what those teachers need to best support those students. And the professional development is connected to those 5 understandings, but very specific to each individual school.
Have they reduced the amount of time teachers spend in teaching?
They look at structuring time for collaboration for teachers and for teachers to work together.
That's sort of a yes?
That's sort of a yes. It's different in each school because some schools require different types of resources, so it's hard to give one general answer across.
Stephanie, what would you point to?
This year, I'd probably point to Washington, D.C. and what's happening within the schools within the LEAD project, where you've got teachers engaged weekly in collaborative learning, and it's focused on content, and it's focused on designing great lessons, and they're learning a lot through that process. But I think it represents some of the very best of PD that we could want for teachers.
Dan, is there any place you'd point to?
Yeah, I think DC and LEAP is a promising program, no question about it. But partly because they're being very specific about the practices they want to see changing, they're measuring that, and they're getting an external evaluator to come in and test whether it's actually making a difference or not. And what separates LEAP from a lot of other programs is you can be pretty sure that if the evaluation says it's not working, they're going to change it. They're going to stop doing it, which is something we tend not to do. But I'd also point to Achievement First, which is the charter management organization that outed themselves. We studied them in the report. They spend about $33,000 per teacher. Just to be clear, the difference is they are seeing far more growth, widespread growth among their teachers.
And they measure growth by student test scores.
In part. They also measure them
Almost
through
entirely,
observations.
yeah.
So I mean, now I will say they can't point to specific PD initiatives that are making a difference there, but they have much more intensive coaching that's going on at the school level, and it is very responsive to the data that comes out about whether teachers' practice is changing and whether kids are doing better.
I want to talk about that question about outcomes, because the new report, Linda's new report, says structured professional learning that results in changes in teacher practices and improvements in student learning outcomes. And when Casey and I were talking prior to this gathering, he said that he expected 3 outcomes from effective professional development. Student improvement, changes in teacher practice, and the creation of teacher leaders. You need to explain the last point.
Okay. So those 3 were the goals of the College Ready Writers Program in the proposal made to the U.S. Department of Education. And the idea is that we didn't want a program that had experts that would be at the front of the room and those would be the only experts. We wanted to get active learning going within the districts in which we were working. And the way to do that was to empower those teachers to help create materials, help generate student models, and empower them to then share that with their peers. It was specifically focused on ELA teachers, but I sat in on a lot of professional development where those ELA teachers were then taking that back to their colleagues in their districts and working with their social studies and their science colleagues and building that collaboration and having those conversations that put that teacher learner in a teacher leader position, and it has a really big impact on student performance when a teacher feels empowered to share what they know with other teachers.
My personal response is that's brilliant. The two aspects of the definition in the report are functional. Teacher's going to change his or her behavior. This says teacher's going to change, be a different person. Are you a different person? Are you now a leader?
I would even go so far as to say it's not just changing teachers, it's helping teachers grow, helping teachers develop. So I've transformed, I've developed, I've grown as a professional, I've grown as an intellectual, and that helps my performance in my job.
Stephanie, what's your response to this, adding a third criterion?
Well, I think it's also not just the individual, it's also about the organization. The culture changes. When teachers grow, improve, they buy into it, their efficacy increases, they want to assume more leadership, then as a result, the culture changes and it becomes one that is in that constant improvement mode. And that's why, you have to get to the point in any professional learning experience where educators see the response from the students. When they attempt to make a change in their practice, they're taking a risk. And so they're going to continue to take that risk when they see that their students benefit. A lot of times teachers don't go through with the kinds of changes they're being asked to make because they aren't recognizing any real difference in their classroom. And so they wonder, why should I try something that makes me feel uncomfortable when the students don't seem to be benefiting? So this is great that it has evolved in this feeling of efficacy, leadership, and empowerment would be another word that I think you would qualify.
You'd look for changes in structure as well. Would
Absolutely.
Really affect, so suppose there are four. So you've got four criteria that, and suppose teachers change their behavior, and suppose teachers become leaders, and the structure changes so the teachers have more time to work together, and said, but student improvement doesn't show up. Was the PD a failure? And anybody can have that. You got 3 out of 4, but the one you don't get,
Yes.
student improvement.
I mean, I would say yes.
It's a failure.
Absolutely.
How about you, Casey?
I agree. It's important.
So
I don't want to say it's all of it, but we had 44 rural high-need school districts in the College Ready Writers Program study. So there were 22 comparisons, and the professional development achieved positive results in 4 different criteria in every single one of those 22 comparisons. So student performance was affected by professional development in that study. So I would absolutely say that we believe, from a National Writing Project perspective, we believe that student performance is very important. I also think, though, that along with that, that can't stand alone. That teachers need to feel mutual respect with their professional development providers. They need to be treated they need to be treated as the professionals and as the intellectuals that they are. And if they don't leave professional development feeling that they have a voice, that they have an intellectual something intellectual to add to that conversation, then I don't think it's a success.
But the bottom line would be student achievement, though.
I would agree.
And student achievement as measured by standardized test scores?
Not entirely.
How else?
Well, in practices that you want to see on behalf of student, in behavior, in
Attendance? So
it
you'd
could be
use
a measure, right?
You'd use multiple measures, Dan?
Exactly.
Standardized test scores are, although they're often written as a formative assessment, they're often interpreted as a summative assessment. I believe that formative assessment, showing growth through formative assessment leads to success on test scores. But we effectively, through the College Ready Writers program, use formative assessment to predict the success that we found.
I wonder, one of the other principles or criteria is the active learning. Are teachers ready for active learning? I mean, they live in a system which is top-down control. It's anti-democratic. I mean, I recall watching professional development years ago when computers were being introduced, and a brilliant PD guy had the teachers sit down in front of the computer and say, you know, you can't hurt this machine. Go ahead, just try this, try that. And they would fail, and they would laugh, and they would have a breakthrough, and it would be spectacular. And then they would go back to their classrooms, and they would lecture the kids on how they discovered stuff. I mean, that was a long time ago, but my question is, are teachers ready? And working in a system which doesn't encourage this, are they really ready? Do they want this? I'm with Stephanie, because you spend a lot of time talking to teachers.
Well, I mean, absolutely. Teachers do not want to sit and be passive recipients of information, nor would they want to stand up in front of their students and offer instruction in that way. And I think teachers value most learning from other teachers. They value most observing great teaching. They value co-teaching. They value coaching and job-embedded support in the moment. And all of those are examples of active learning. Mm-hmm. And, you know, when teachers are presented with new curriculum, with new instructional materials, the most powerful professional learning is professional learning that actually puts them in the role of students so that they can experience what it is that their students will experience when they implement those practices for their students.
So, but you said teachers, you know, about taking risks. Are teachers risk takers? What do they need to enable them to take risks?
They need a culture where they know risk and where they know failure is permitted, where they recognize that failure is just another opportunity to learn, where there is trust. And also, they need a culture where they know when they are challenged in implementing something new, that where they can go to get the support they will need to be successful.
So they need the help. They need leadership. It also comes back to leadership.
I'd add one other thing. I agree with all that. One of the things we found in the Mirage, which was startling to me, is we asked 10,000 teachers a very simple question: do you have weaknesses in your instruction? And it was kind of a throwaway. Only 47% of respondents said, yes, I have weaknesses. And that's not because teachers have an inflated ego at all. No. That's a reflection of the culture they're working in, where they are hearing whatever you're doing is just fine. Yeah, yeah. So the other piece that I think is really important, you know, Casey obviously has it in his school, is leadership and a culture in the school where everybody is taking risks because they understand standing pat is not good unless all of our kids are succeeding. So we want to change. We understand we have to change.
It's also possible teachers would answer that way because there's no real reward for saying, yeah, I have some weaknesses. Somebody's going to say, oh yeah, you go. Now I know your weaknesses. I mean, that's a culture thing as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean,
absolutely.
I always like to tell people the story of WD-40, which I imagine everyone has. Do you know why it's called WD-40? Well, it was two engineers down in Florida who were hoping to cash in on the NASA, you know, this stuff, and they set out to make a water-dissoluble substance, and they kept very careful records. In their first experiment, they labeled WD-1. It didn't work. Well, you can figure out which one worked. So they failed 39 times, and now they're riding high. I mean, teachers need to know that too, a lot of stuff. And also that collaboration where you can say, you know, this didn't work. Do you have that?
Well, I was just going to speak to the climate that, you know, we have to be able to take risks. We have to be able to have failure to get to that success. But something else that we need to add into this is that idea of time, the sustained effort of having the time to work through whatever failures that we have that lead us to that success. And, you know, yeah, I have that climate right now in my school, but when we did the College Ready Writers program study, we were working in 44 school districts that often didn't have that climate and that culture, and it took time. It took 90 hours of professional development over 2 years in order to get us to that point, but we could get there when we had time.
That speaks actually to the earlier question around student achievement. Is student achievement the ultimate, goal? And yes, one of many goals, but student achievement after 6 months, after 12 months, what happens? And the reasons why people throw things against the wall and they don't stick is because they want instant.
They pull the plug too quickly.
Exactly.
So patience may be another.
So in the studies,
yeah.
some of them don't have teacher results until a year out after teachers have time to really internalize these new practices and get to practice and work on it.
Well, the report, the seventh principle is sustained over time, but essentially you can't just pull it up by the roots to see if it's growing and thereby kill it, which may be the instincts that, so to go back to the mirage, Dan, that seems to be being used as justification for cutting the federal funds. Are you?
Not based on anything we're advocating for, because we certainly are not in favor of cutting. We're in favor of reallocating the resource, and there are many schools and many school districts that don't have adequate resources. So cutting federal funds, for example, would be, in our view, a very bad idea.
But tell me why, I would like actually to hear from Stephanie as well, is why is this a federal priority? I mean, if it's valuable, shouldn't districts and states be spending the money, or spending all the money?
Well, here's one thing, John, I would say about that. The federal role traditionally has been largely about battling inequity,
Right.
which doesn't always happen very effectively at the local and state level, often does not. And Title II is an example. Catherine and I were just talking about this earlier, where they're targeting funds towards districts that are serving high concentrations of low-income kids. So that, I think, is a legitimate federal role. The one thing I would say is, on Title II, yes, we're battling now, including us, TNTP. We have been our own worst enemy on that for many years, because, and I'll stand up and take some responsibility for this. When I was working in New York City, most Title II dollars are not used very wisely. And then, so it's not the mirage, it's the fact that you can point to billions and billions of dollars being spent and very, very little evidence of efficacy, and that's on us as a field. Now we've got a little bit of, the fervor of the recently converted, and now we're going to use evidence and we're going to show impact, but we haven't done that for a long, long time.
But you're saying it's a federal priority because of the low-income kids? Yeah.
It should be, in my
Stephanie?
view, yes.
Right, and if that's what the federal role is, and if we're going to invest Title I dollars in the students who are most underserved, then we absolutely need to invest Title II dollars in the teachers who are charged with serving them.
Yeah, makes sense. I want to open this up for questions. Are there folks who might want to throw a question? There may be a microphone. Here it comes. Would you stand and tell us who you are and then present your question? Thank you. And if others want to ask a question, just give me a hand. Yeah.
I'm Betsy Wertheim. I'm on the board of an amazing new school here in the Washington area called the Feynman School, which is being designed to teach kids the whole STEM stuff, but everything else. The whole teaching practice there is asking questions. It's not telling them the answer, but it's the discovery. And one of the things I'm struck by is the shift in language, which ends up on the cover of The Economist and a variety of other things. We live in a world of lifetime learning, which I think has to be continually expressed.
But I need your question.
The question I have for you, which is based on a teacher that I met in Berkeley in the Martin Luther King Middle School, who was brilliant, and I went up to tell him how good he was. He said, "I just wish we were more respected." And I think that what teachers do from birth through 12th grade are the most important teachers that we have. How do we develop a real respect for what you're doing? How do we tell the stories so the rest of the country understands we
You wish that they were more respected. I first thought you were saying that you wish they were more introspective, but you're saying respected.
No. One does not exclude the other.
All right, let's talk about that issue of respect for the profession. Casey, you should start.
Okay.
Do you feel respected in your community?
I do to an extent. I think that we're talking about multiple layers of culture here. That it's American culture, but it's state culture and local district culture. But I would just state that my colleagues across the country are community professionals and community intellectuals, and I think that it is a cultural shift that we need to make with multiple stakeholders that values that input and that status.
And what's the first step? That's what she wants.
I would say the first step is continuing to provide title funds so that we can get professional development and keep growing. And
It's a bottom line kind of guy.
we need, as you just mentioned, lifelong learning. We need to give teachers the ability to embody that lifelong learning through professional development and effective professional development. at that.
Stephanie?
Well, I'm going to give a kind of short idea. I've always had this dream that on the first day of school, now remember this is my fantasy, I can get up and I can fly across America, and in front of every school will be the billboard that says, at school, everyone's job is to learn. Because as a society, we have recognized that within every school, we're going to provide time and resources, invest in the learning of students as well as the teachers. And I think that would demonstrate respect for the profession. So
That's a new understanding, though. I don't think the public thinks of teachers as learners, right?
well, that's why,
Yeah.
that's what
That's
I
right,
think
yeah.
is one of the most important messages that we need to get out there.
Dan, how would you build respect?
So, no question, there are things that folks have talked about, Casey's talked about. We need to lift up examples of teachers who are doing incredible things quietly every day, and we try to do that at TNTP and other organizations do that. But we're not passive actors. We're not going to get more respect by banging on the table and saying, you all should respect us. Right? We have to show that we aren't just fighting for resources. We're dynamic. We're willing to change. We're willing to take risks as a profession. We're willing to engage with parents and communities and kids in a different way. So in most places, I'll give you one small but I think profound change we could make. Start asking kids what they want and what they need, and start asking kids about their experience of our instruction. We do that in probably less than 1% of the places. That might cause the folks who are skeptics out there about teachers being terrific community
And
professionals.
then use social media to spread those results. If I could
yes.
make a shameless plug for my new book, I've got two chapters, not just one, two, about that question about building respect. Question? Yeah, who's got the mic? Go here. And then we'll go to say, we have.
So one thing.
Your name and.
Oh, sure. I'm John Stokey from University of Maryland. One quick comment on the parent aspect. As a parent of twins, the worst thing to hear is, oh, there's a teacher PD day. I have to fight with my wife constantly and stand up to teachers because she's like, what are they really doing in PD where we have to get childcare? So that's one point. But I wanted to come to, I wanted to address Dan and then some of the.
I want a question.
It's coming.
Okay.
Could change actually come too fast? Because you talked about DC and LEAP, and it seems like sometimes, especially in DC, there's constant change as opposed to taking time to sit, as Maria and others talked about, really letting a program marinate a little bit as opposed to constantly changing. So that's the question.
But can change come too fast? Probably gets pulled up by the roots with new stuff all the time. Yeah, Stephanie.
Okay, well, back to the worst thing you can hear is that it's a teacher PD day. I think two things. One is schools have a responsibility to make sure parents learn what it is that teachers are learning and doing to benefit their students on that day. And I think that goes back to leadership. But teachers too. If teachers said how important it was to parents, parents would say, then I'm all for it.
But does PD have to be in a whole?
No, but that's my second point. Okay, so really, because teachers want time throughout the school year, better if we can think about how to take these PD days and reconfigure the time totally, and so that teachers can have the time that they need to collaborate with their colleagues and get the just-in-time support that they need and the planning that needs to take place throughout the year. But when you do have those occasional days, let's make sure we do a better job of communicating. Can change go too quickly? Can we have too much change? Of course, there's a way we can moderate change. But really, what's happening in DC, This year's LEAP program was a way they refined last year's impact. I mean, this is a total plan that is about improving how we get the support to teachers that they need most. And I think that DC has been very thoughtful about it, and they'll refine what they did this year in order to get teachers the support they need next year.
I would bet the best PD is probably in increments inside the school day, or at least some. I mean, I remember years ago following 2 first-year teachers in different schools, and the key difference was in one school they had grand rounds, where the teachers would get to sit one period where they'd talk about kids. What are you doing with Casey? Is it working? I moved him up to the front. That kind of thing. I mean, that's professional development also. That's or at least improvement. And it made a huge difference in the lives of teachers. Let's take maybe one more question, or maybe 2 more, maybe 3 more, but no, 1 more.
Hi, I'm Molly Dunn from the University of Maryland. Hi, Maria. My question has to do about this idea of respect for teachers and lifting them up and going beyond sort of the first day calling them learners or finding ways to really use social media. Like, what can we do that would professionalize the teaching workforce that's not just national board certification, or that's not just moving up to department chair or admin role?
Professionalize.
Well, so I can start off. I mean, one thing certainly is about pay, and we have written about this, and we think for most professionals, you should be able to get to 6 figures in a place like DC. Certainly, you should be able to get to 6 figures in 6 years if you're doing a great job. And there are very, very few teachers that have the ability to
front load the pay system. Yeah.
Front load the pay system for the teachers who are really performing well, and that's not all teachers, but that's a lot of them. So that's one that I think is really important. But with that pay has to come some showing of creativity, dynamism, so it can't just be we want to get paid to do things the same way we've done things for the past 30 years. And that's a much longer conversation, but I just throw out that concept.
And anything else?
Well, I think there's a vision. We need to present a vision of teaching as a profession. We need to make sure that all teachers can see career pathways that don't necessarily lead to administration, that teachers can be prepared and supported and compensated for taking on teacher leadership roles. I think all of those things send the message that this is a profession and this profession merits respect.
We have time for 1 more question? All right, we'll do this, in the second row,
Hi, I'm Crystal Brumfield on the LEAP Data and Strategy team at DCPS.
How'd we do?
A plant.
Thank you, everyone, for all the attention. So my question really is I wanted to hear a little bit more about the mandatory teacher buy-in of professional development and kind of get an idea of the pros and cons of both arguments around that. So is it effective for a teacher professional development program to be mandatory across all content areas? And or does it become a strand on teacher accountability?
Second part.
So I'm going to jump in, but I'm going to defer some of that to the rest of the panel. But I would say that we found in our study that change didn't happen by force. That it took time and it took relationship building between the coaches and the teachers, and the real change happened in the classroom. And
what if some teachers were reluctant? What happened?
It happened over time, and it happened with co-planning and even co-teaching. And it was gradual, and we didn't see results that we could measure for the first year until about 1.5 years in. But you could see even some of those resistant relationships initially through that confident persistence, that just staying with those teachers and mutually working on that mutual respect, okay? Those led to some of the most powerful, deep relationships in that professional relationship between the mentor and the teacher in the classroom.
I would suspect also that it requires identifying the ones who are going to grab hold of it aggressively and making sure they are celebrated so that they can help pull on the other people. The same thing with adoption of technology in schools. You can't force teachers to do it, but you can do it, you can bring them along. Anybody else want to add a final comment, because we're running out of time?
Just in terms of the design, that's why it's so important when you're designing to think about these potential obstacles. And if you're thinking about mandatory, what's the culture and the climate in the school? And how are the teachers relating to the administration? That can halt a well-designed professional development program right there. So really thinking about what are the specific needs of this context and what's going on. Maybe there's a school that wants to adopt a professional development, and it's more about creating these relationships, but really being careful to think beforehand about the design as well as the implementation.
Final thought, Stephanie, Dan?
And also within the study, you talk about giving adults choices. So while we may have agreement within a school around our highest priority needs, a target for our professional learning and what we're all going to learn, it doesn't necessarily mean that we all have to learn it in the same way. So if there are places along the way where we can give adults some control and choice over how they achieve the intended outcomes, it's another way to deal with the mandatory aspect, but honor that we are adults and we need to make some choices about our learning.
Dan?
Well, I think the context is important. If the mandate is to come to a one-size-fits-all PD session for, where you're a 10-year teacher learning about the basics of classroom management, that is a really bad idea. If what you're talking about is, here's our vision for excellence in the school or the school system, and so you're going to be getting feedback every week against that vision, and we're going to help you to improve, that you can't opt out of. Yeah. Everybody has to be pulling towards this vision, and most people will get there. If you can't get there, this may not be the place for you. That should be mandatory.
The question was asked about respect. Providing effective professional development is a high form of respect for teachers. It says, we value you, here's some great opportunities to help you learn. Yes, you're going to fail, but we don't care because we're going to pick you up along the way. So this report may seem kind of wonky and all that stuff, but it's actually very critical. We've gone through at least 16 years of real hostility toward teaching as a profession and toward teachers. And turning that around, especially in this climate, will not be easy. It does take small, important, wonky-sounding steps like this. I ask you to give it up for this terrific panel. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be taking about a 10-minute break. We'll be starting up just right around 11 o'clock, so please feel free to grab refreshments, use the restroom, and we'll see you all back here shortly. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to be starting back up here in another minute or two. So if you could please make your way back to your seat, we'll get the second panel started. Thank you.
Shouldn't you be in the middle?
Hi,
Lillian.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
I think we're live.
Say no, we need to. No secrets.
Love it. Okay, hi everyone. We're going to get started shortly.
How are you?
How are you?
Good to see you.
Just catch up later.
Woo! Sorry about that.
Oh, I thought that was mine.
That was me. All right, well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here this morning to talk about professional learning. We are very excited to have this conversation, and I am personally very honored to be moderating a panel of such distinguished people in the education field. So I'm Catherine Brown. I'm the Vice President for Education Policy here at the Center for American Progress. And I'm going to introduce our panelists. So they really need no introduction. But first we have Randy Weingarten, who is president of the 1.6 million member American Federation of Teachers. And at her direction, the AFT has developed a model to transform teacher evaluations from simply rating teachers to a tool for continuous improvement and feedback. She has led the AFT committee that called for all prospective teachers to meet a high entry standard, as in medicine or law, so that they're prepared from the day that they enter the classroom. We also have Lillian Lowry, who serves now as the Education Trust Vice President for Pre-K through 12 Policy Research and Practice, where she leads the organization's ambitious agenda to focus national attention on inequities in public education. She's also served as president and CEO of Future Ready Columbus, a public-private nonprofit focused on college and workforce readiness, and as the state superintendent for schools in Maryland and Delaware. Next, we have Linda Darling-Hammond, author of the report that was featured this morning, obviously, and president of CEO of the Learning Policy Institute and professor emeritus at Stanford University. And she's written extensively and received many awards for her work in education policy dating back for decades. And then finally, Aaliyah Samuel, who directs the Education Division at the NGA, National Governors Association Center for Best Practices. And her work has focused on programs and policies related to education systems, building, early literacy, language development, evidence-based programs, aligning programs and policies, and education reform initiatives. And she has also served as a longtime teacher and principal. So we're going to start, this panel is focused on the policy implications of the research that was discussed in the last panel. And I'd like to start with the budget. So as was mentioned, the Trump-DeVos budget eliminates Title II, which is the title in the Every Student Succeeds Act that's targeted at supporting teachers and helping them grow their practice. And one of the justifications that was made for this, or the reason that the Trump and DeVos administration articulated that this money needs to be eliminated, is that it's duplicative and unnecessary. And I'd love to hear responses from all of the panelists about their reaction to that proposal. Let's just start with the facts. Is it duplicative? What are the other federal sources of funding that can be used for teacher development?
It's ridiculous that they would say that it's duplicative. There needs to be 3, 4, 5 times as much money in the federal budget for education as there is right now. I would say there needs to be 20 times as much as there is right now. And I find what they're doing to be venal, callous, catastrophic and cruel. So you could have a policy discussion about this, but I was just in McDowell County, West Virginia, which is one of the poorest counties in the United States of America. Rural counties, southwestern West Virginia, coal country. They cannot live, they cannot be a school system without Title I, Title II, and Title IV. And this is a county that voted for Trump. They are on a shoestring right now. So if you want to actually give anybody some training on anything, they need Title II money. So it's just completely cruel, callous, ridiculous, venal, and catastrophic.
I'll just add a thought.
Please. No one disagrees, we can just move on.
Which is that almost, if you think about what ESSA is trying to do overall, which is to close, the opportunity gap, close the achievement gap. It is targeted, including Title II, is targeted at the highest need communities in our country, where budgets have been declining for years. 30-some states have not yet returned to pre-recession education budget levels. More and more poverty for children, more and more needs that school systems have to meet. And teachers are working very hard to try to figure out how to teach very diverse kids to these new standards, as our leaders trying to figure out how to do this. And none of the rest of ESSA works if you don't have professional learning. You can't do any of the rest of it. So it is, in some ways, the sine qua non of the bill. The other irony is that just as ESSA incorporated many of the lessons from research into Title II and said, here's the kind of professional learning you should sponsor, which has the features that we have just been describing, just at that moment where the funds would be most well targeted at the kids who need it and most well spent on the kinds of professional learning that could make a difference, to lose it would really be catastrophic for the rest of the agenda that we have for education.
And I'll just add on to that. We recently had a human capital meeting with 9 states in San Diego, and we had out of the 9 states, 7 have not submitted their ESSA state plans. And we had an opportunity, the governor's educational policy advisor was part of the state team, somebody from the SEA. And in listening to the states talk about what some of their challenges were, specifically around Title II, it became very clear that this was a dominant piece of the discussion. And for these states, they are in the process of working very closely with the governor's office and the SEA. They're trying to create these really robust, innovative plans around professional development. But there's this big pause or almost a sigh of uncertainty because they don't know what they'll actually be able to do and what then the implications will be for the districts and ultimately the students that they're serving. And so I think it's really important to think about these states who have been, since the ESSA discussions really took off, thinking about what they could do and would like to do and have gone through strategic planning process and all these other pieces to try to create a state plan, and to have the uncertainty of knowing what they can implement or cannot because of the budget discussions. It's a real challenging time for the states.
And to once again reiterate what was said by the panelists, we had resource equity challenges before anyone talked about a new budget. So let's forget about taking away the $2.1 billion. Let's talk about just maintaining that. We still have resource equity matters, and you've heard examples from Randy and others where as a commissioner for a state, within a state, the resource equity matters challenge some districts far more than others because of the local tax base that they can bring to the support for their teachers. So moving this new, newly refocused ESSA Elementary and Secondary Education Act to, and we talked about this in the green room, to focus more on poverty than on population will somewhat, even if we maintain the money that we have now, it will be more focused on those challenged districts and schools who are already really folding under the weight of trying to provide resources for their teachers so that they can provide outcomes for their students that will have them ready to take on the challenges of college and career.
But can I actually I mean, these ladies are all very polite, which is part of what I love about them. But think about, and John actually said this to me earlier, so I'm going to credit him with this. Think about, just take a step back. Public education is a public endeavor. We are asking students to learn really different things. We're asking teachers to teach different ways. We have from research a different kind of idea about how to deal with equity issues, including the engagement. And then we say, okay, we're not giving you anything to help you do this. Just sink or swim. We just went through with teacher evaluations all of that sink or swim. We've gone through sink or swim a lot. And it shows a complete and utter disrespect for our profession. But frankly, it shows a lot of disrespect for a lot of different professions too, because they cut all the training for doctors. They cut NIH. They cut a bunch of other things. So what you're seeing in this entire budget is a withdrawal of the kind of equity supports that are necessary for other people's children and other people's communities to actually level the playing field. And that's why I am so outraged about it.
So I think this I appreciate the passion. So let me just address the elephant in the room. I mean, people on the right that have criticized Title II, and as Dan Weisberg pointed out in the last panel, it's not just been people on the right. People on across the ideological spectrum have said that Title II hasn't been well used. So what is the response to that? How much responsibility do those who have made those arguments, and I put the Center for American Progress in that bucket, hold for the situation that we're in now? And if you could articulate a little bit more, Linda, you referenced this, Leah, and we were talking about this earlier, these changes that have been made in Title II during the Every Student Succeeds Act, and why you have optimism that the funding will now be better spent than it has been in the past, and we ought to let this play out.
Well, because we've all acknowledged that there has been, bad professional development and people have suffered through it and all of that kind of thing. But the statement that Title II was not well used in the past, which could be partly true, is actually one of these things where had the federal government wanted to know how it was being used and whether it was successful, they could have commissioned an evaluation and did not. I did a study a few years ago, actually for Learning Forward. I don't know where Stephanie went to, but she's probably still around here. Looking at 4 states that had evidence of very successful professional learning programs that they had done statewide. And one of the things we found was that it relied on Title II money. So there was effective use of the money, and there was probably some ineffective use as well. But we really don't know because the policymakers sort of went, la, 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 we don't want to know. Therefore, we can claim it's being misused. It's kind of like voter fraud and welfare fraud and all kinds of things that get claimed without actually an evidence base. So I think that probably there was misuse of some of the funds or poor use of some, but there was also effective use of some. I do think that the field was very busy in that whole era trying to correct what was seen as the ineffective set of strategies under NCLB, and ESSA includes a lot of knowledge, learning, and research as it tries to recalibrate many of the parts of the law. And so I think there is a reasonable chance that given the framework in the law, which calls for sustained duration of professional learning with job embedded components and collaboration and content focus and so on, particularly holds up certain kinds of strategies. And we hope with this kind of research, nobody's done this before, to look and say, well, where you have highly rigorous studies that show outcomes, what at least did they do? I think you would see quite a bit of transformation in professional development, which would be a very useful thing.
I would say one of the major reasons that we stay the course is that over the last 5 or 6 years, every state, whatever the state calls them, have really moved to more rigorous standards. And I will give example for my time in Delaware and Maryland, that process was owned by our teachers. And so each time when I had the opportunity to leave Delaware and go to Maryland, and when I left Maryland, it wasn't dependent on the leader or any mandated force saying that these teachers will have to do that. What we framed out was the what, that we needed more rigorous standards so our children could be engaged in deeper learning. And why was framed out for them. Because if we want them to be college and career ready and be able to access the opportunities that await them, they have to have conceptual knowledge that is portable. When I left Maryland in particular, there were some folks who wanted, oh good, she's gone. Now we'll get rid of these standards and we'll do what we wanted to do. It was the teacher, led by teachers and their district administrators who stood up and said, absolutely not. We have invested our time and energy in this. And with that came how we unpack those standards. And we all know that initially it was a bumpy start. But once we kind of settle into the work and our teachers really embrace the standards because of the ownership to learning that students must now embrace, they owned it. They loved coming together collaboratively. They are the content experts. They wanted to do job embedded kind of professional development so that they could get feedback from their colleagues and reflect on their work and tie that to formative assessments, competency-based skills of how their children were progressing. And once we told them what we're focused on is your children are growing and not this absolute artificial proficiency mark, they were all in and they own that process. To take that away from them now, when they have become acclimated to actually working in an active, collaborative way around teaching and learning would be criminal.
Leah, are you seeing the same kind of examples of the way states are using Title II funds, and what would be the impact of this $2.3 billion investment being completely withdrawn?
Well, it certainly will vary state by state. I'll go back to the human capital meeting just because that's the most recent tangible example. Of these 7 states who have not submitted their plans, they have almost categories of, if theoretically everything goes as planned, this is what we could do. If we can't, we'll cut this. And they slowly identify what they would cut based off of impact. So of course you cut what will have, again, in theory, minimal impact, and then you just continue to cut and cut and cut and cut from there. And so, I mean, the implications are huge. And it goes into an old saying, which is probably not, doesn't sound the best, but you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. You know, you really have to identify those areas of gaps or areas of improvement and then continue to work forward. There certainly needs to be a progress monitoring mechanism in place when we talk about professional development. I mean, I can tell you as a former principal, the differences from one school site to another varied vastly on the professional development offered, and it goes into some of the core components that were mentioned at the panel earlier, and then even now in our discussion of the awareness of the content, of the culture of the building. But one piece that was not stated earlier that I also think is important is to understand the data pieces that you are collecting, why you're collecting that, and how to monitor that so that you can then justify or be able to articulate the professional development you're offering and then its impacts to the children that you're trying to serve.
Let me just say from the ground up, just a few numbers I want to just throw out. Take a place that's actually really had it embedded, professional development for a while, Meriden, Connecticut. They've seen a 62% decline in suspensions and an 89% decline in expulsions. And I raise that issue because, you know, the elephant in the room for most of us when we started teaching, or even when we're trying to teach in different ways, is classroom management. And so that kind of embedded buy-in. Buy-in right now is tremendously different than it was a few years ago. 1.1 million people, almost close to 1.2 million people are on the AFT's professional learning platform, Share My Lesson. 2,500 AFT educators and train the trainers were educated in this school year by AFT. Over 600 teacher leaders in AFT in the last couple of years in 20 different districts. And that just gets continued and continued and deepened and deepened. There is a buy-in bottom up that we didn't see before that creates this kind of check and balance so that you don't have the kind of professional development of let's do an introductory 2-hour lesson again and then we do nothing more than that, which is what it was when I was teaching.
And if I just may, one of the things that the new law adds is that teachers and leaders have to be a part of the planning. Exactly. So to the point that was made early on, instead of collecting data and then figuring out at the end what we do with it and what is the data are telling us, it is more appropriate for us to work with them, find out what their needs are, as Casey said, and walk into the plan with what our metrics for success would look like.
Can I just add another piece to this? Particularly on the state level, we are seeing a trend in discussion around more and more almost open certification processes that allow folks from outside of the field to come in and begin teaching, which then also raises the importance of professional development if you're going to have, in order to address the teacher shortage gaps that many states are facing. Opening up your certification or your teaching pool to those that are non-certified to come in, this professional development piece is critically important, especially when you look at where many of these teachers, incoming teachers who are not teachers but learning to be teachers, are going to be placed and are high risk. And actually, I hate using the term high risk. These kids are really high possibility children who they just need the right person to activate the potential within them. So. Sorry, that's my own little soapbox. It's really important to think about the Title II supports in place and what it means, because we are seeing Arizona just recently passed legislation. We've heard other governors starting to talk about this, and so I think making them aware of what the implications are from multiple fronts helps bring awareness of the importance of the professional development piece, but what those Title II dollars can do specifically for the teachers who would be placed in certain settings.
Thank you. So I think there's been some complacency around the budget because it seems so extreme that nobody thinks it could actually be realized. And I'm curious, if you, Randy, think the budget is in fact dead on arrival, that in the same way that we were protected against the draconian 2017 approach proposal, that the Democrats will come in and save the day and make sure none of these cuts actually get enacted.
Well, anytime somebody says that to me, I remind people what they were saying in June, July, and August. Oh, Trump's never going to get elected. I mean, and so it doesn't, this is not, I think we take it for granted at our peril. The Democrats have 48 people, and they have been in the Senate, and they have been surprisingly, or they've been in surprising solidarity on issues like the budget and whatnot. But even when they did, I think, a Herculean job in the 2017 budget, there's still a huge cut to Title II. And, we had, and frankly, if we don't make our case about the education cuts, there's a lot of really bad other things in that budget too. And they're not going to be able to put everything back in. Maybe they'll be able to put some things out, maybe they won't. Maybe Mitch McConnell will actually take the nuclear option in terms of legislation too. So I find that this dead on arrival talk is happy talk, and it is basically putting your head in the sand, and I'm taking it incredibly seriously.
I don't know if anyone else wants to comment, or even more specifically on specific actions and efforts that are ongoing to protect against these cuts, or grassroots efforts you're seeing among your local affiliates.
I just want to shout out the governors. I mean, I've never seen a letter. I mean, a lot of us, we are in a position that we have to fight, and we always fight, and people see that. The governors put this amazing letter out about these cuts, Republican and Democratic governors in the NGA, and I just want to say thank you.
And with the Education Trust's work, when ESSA was reauthorized, the organization started doing boot camps where they were going into local communities and finding out who the advocates were, bipartisan, because all politics is local, around what the local priorities were. And there's bipartisan support that we continue these Title II dollars. But teaching them how to advocate with their state legislators and hopefully give pressure to the federal legislators to support this Title II funding, because they are starting to see across many states, Tennessee, Louisiana, Maryland, name them, really great results from the reframed professional development that Linda describes in the study that she presented today.
There was a lot of talk on the last panel, and obviously this is something that the Center for American Progress has been very focused on for the last 2.5 years, on raising respect for the teaching profession. And I'm curious how you see this budget elevating the teaching profession, if it will. What, do we see a lot of evidence? All right, it doesn't sound like a sincere question. I'll just put it out there.
See you trying to be so neutral.
Yeah, I mean, from where I'm sitting, respect in this country is so bound up in pay that when you're talking about cutting, 9% of the federal budget and making dramatic cuts at the local level, it is inevitably going to result in cuts to class sizes, reductions in teachers' pay, or at least reductions in the amount that they might have gotten otherwise. And it's hard to imagine how that sets us on a path towards teachers having more respect in their community and doing a better job by students. But I'm curious, that was more of a speech than a question.
I want to point out that CAP did a study just a couple of years ago which found that in more than 30 states, teachers were eligible for as many as 4 different government assistance programs. A teacher who has a family of 4 could have their own kids on free and reduced price lunch at school because their pay was so low. So the issue of teacher salaries has been is a really challenging one. It is highly variable from state to state. We've been doing a lot of work at LPI on teacher shortages, and there are states that do pay teachers well, train them exceptionally well, support their entry, their professional development, their mentoring, their induction, and don't have teacher shortages in the same way that other parts of the country do. So it is highly variable, but it certainly is a part of the story. But the other part of it is teachers being involved in the management and the control of the technical aspects of the work, having a voice in decision making, doing things in the classroom that they think really will work for kids, having collaboration and learning opportunities with colleagues are all part of that, issue of having a respected profession in which you can really achieve the goals that you set out to achieve when you came into teaching.
From my perspective, and I will weave some of my own personal opinion into this response. I am a former educator. I am an educator. I was a former elementary teacher, taught special ed, taught general ed, went on to become an assistant principal, and I fundamentally believe not only in the public system, but in educators. And I think what made me get into the policy realm is realizing how many policymakers in education have never been an educator or stepped foot in a classroom or spent a day in a classroom other than what they may have experienced with their own child. And so my bridge from leaving my principalship to come into this policy world was because at a particular time in education, it was 2009, so if you could kind of rewind back to 2009, I was a principal in southern Arizona. So we were about 1.5 years into the recession. Common Core was rolling out. Another bill called SB 1070 was rolling out. I was taking my school through Title I application status. And one policy after another, after another, after another was completely dominating the decisions I was able to make as a site-based administrator. And so that is really what was my catalyst to getting into this policy world. And I think more and more, if educators, if we want respect for the field, we need to have our voices heard at the policy table. And how you get to the policy table is we have to wiggle in and make room for us, because no one's going to open up the chair for us and say, hey, come here, let me hear your voice. And I think the same way other fields are very protective of their space. I mean, me as an educator couldn't go into a hospital and say, you physician, this is how you should run. There's a certain level of respect that happens there. We need to create that own environment for ourselves. And so the passive approach is not working for us as a broader field. We need to help change the mentality that just anyone can teach, because just because you're passionate about young children does not mean you can handle a class of 22, 25, 30, depending on where you work. So I think those are just some fundamental pieces that we need to think about as we talk about strategy, because really this is bigger than Title II, this is bigger than Title I, this is bigger than the current administration, it is bigger than the current governor in office. This is a bigger issue that we as a field need to develop a strategy to hone in on that respect and be able to advocate for not only what we do every day, but the long-term impacts. Sorry, that's my soapbox.
So
No, go ahead.
So the we have actually been through too much reform churn, and I am very just like I said, I wanted to give props to the NGA. I really want to give props to Linda, because she has actually done some really fundamental, common sense work through research for the last several decades. And I think that the work that she's produced here today and this week, really important in terms of kind of stepping back and thinking, what really works in education to help children excel? And that's really important in terms of the research and that conversation. We're not having that conversation right now. The conversation we're having is an existential threat, in that by 2015, there was a coming together of saying that just like No Child Left Behind was too excessive for various different reasons, or let's say didn't hit the mark for various different reasons, Race to the Top didn't either. And let's take a step back and let's think through the research in a bipartisan way about what we need to do for both equity and excellence. And that was the fundamental beauty of what happened in ESSA. And within literally a minute and a half of Donald Trump becoming president, first in November 8th, because very little of this was discussed before November 8th. But with him becoming president, and then the announcement of Betsy DeVos, we're having a really different conversation. The conversation now is whether public education, and whether or not there's going to be a public system that is accountable and transparent and non-discriminatory to children, half of whom are poor in the public system, or whether we're going to basically have a market-based, unregulated market-based system which siphons off all this funding. That's the budget discussion. That's the discussion right now. And so I feel sometimes when we're having this amazing discussion about what works, we're on a hamster wheel, rushing and rushing and rushing and saying, yes, we as school teachers, we want to help our kids. But the bigger discussion is constantly taking the investment and basically re-challenging us on whether public education.
I think this is a really nice segue into what are the other policies that are impacted, because we've talked at length about Title II, we've talked at length about the budget, but there are a broad range of policies that impact professional learning, from teacher evaluation, which was no longer federally required as a result of ESSA. But I'm wondering if there are other levers, other particular policies that you wanted to mention that you think could be positive levers for change.
You were about to say something, so.
No, it was going to, we've moved on from the budget.
Okay.
Oh, you can loop back on the budget, it's okay.
I was just going to simply say that a major newspaper just published findings on a report about employee satisfaction. And it wasn't money, it wasn't salary, although I'm sure it helps. The first one was feeling supported. And the second factor was leadership that supported them and fought for the resources that they needed. So I was simply going to say this budget says to our teachers, we're not going to support you.
Well, and I was going to pick up on leadership, so in response to this question about other levers, because we're talking about teachers, but leaders are obviously essential for every aspect of all of the transformations we talk about in schools, and are the key reason that teachers stay or leave, administrative supports and leadership development. And there are lots of ways that could get supported. We did a report just a few weeks ago on leadership development programs that actually have positive effects on practices in schools and outcomes in schools as well. And under Title I and Title II, as well as other places in the law, that's another place that could be leveraged. And states are beginning to realize that they really have to make this investment. I do a lot of work in other countries. And Randy's comments made me think about, I had a flashback to Singapore, where I've spent quite a bit of time, which is a country that has had very continuous growth and development. They had no system at all in 1965. They're now leading the world on most of the indicators in the PISA analyses and others. But literally in 1965, very few Singaporeans went to school at all. Malay children had no education. They had to build the whole system. And then they've just increasingly improved it with research. They come to the US and see the best things we do and take them back and scale them up and just continually improve and improve and improve. We, by contrast, are on this, pendulum swing. And so now we do one thing and we do that for a while. The politics changes, the board changes, the legislature changes, the governor changes, the president changes. Stop doing that, let's do something else. And the amazing efforts of educators in American schools, which actually are succeeding in many respects against the odds, are to adapt and adapt and adapt to this, ever-changing peripatetic policymaking. Part of what we need is less policymaking, frankly. Less, intervention of new ideas you were describing that earlier, yet another thing, and really just making the investments. And if you had adequate, equitable investments in schools, which need to come from the top to allocate fairly to communities, and you had investments in the professional capacity of educators, you could almost stop there and say, now figure out how to educate the kids in your communities, instead of having 55 other mandates and so on coming down. So the biggest policy lever would be that investment in an equitable system with well-trained educators, well-supported educators in all communities.
I'm glad you raised this point, because I think one of the examples that a lot of other countries that are high-performing can show for us is how you can design a truly equitable system, and this is an area where the U.S. really does fall short. And how do you see, we're back to the budget, but Title II as a driver of equity?
Well, it's much more targeted now, for one thing. Let others chime in.
So I think both Title II and Title IV, Title I, I would argue, has always been targeted, but both Title II and Title IV were targeted. The difference, though, is that still 90% of what funds education is funded in the local and state tax base, and there's lots of inequities there as well. But just off of your other question and Linda's response, I think we've all kind of taken a step back and said, let's actually speak not in pedagogies or in policy speak, but in English in terms of what we think works as levers to help children over the long term. And I would actually say, if you do, and I know I gave this speech in January, but if you do actually focus on 4 pillars and the investment for those pillars, well-being of children, and start where children are as opposed to where we want them to be. Well-being, engagement in powerful learning, so that kids want to come to school and want to engage critically and want to engage in their learning. Building the capacity of the workforce like Linda just talked about, and creating this collaboration that we've all talked about. Those four fundamental, whether you call them strategies or pillars or features or levers, that's what's baked into ESSA. And then when you have leadership that's able to do those four things and an investment, schools work and systems work.
The policy around content in context really matters, and framing that out the way that was demonstrated in the 35 models that Linda explicated was very powerful, because if we look at the research carefully, the context was the student they were serving, be they English language learners or culturally economically disadvantaged students. The teachers were doing exactly what Casey talked about early on, looking at those who were sitting in front of them and actually using the data to inform what they were going to do around professional development in context in the classroom, job embedded. And to add to that, another policy is how we use time. In Delaware, when they decided to go into the standards refresh with adopting the new, more rigorous standards, we decided to go statewide with professional learning communities. We had an expert company come in and actually look at all, because the master schedule dictates what's important in a school. It's the master. So what is going on in that schedule? And there was so much wasted time in the schedule that we found where we could give teachers common planning periods. So during the school day, they had the opportunity to sit together, look at data, plan together, and decide who was going to be responsible for what. So it was shared responsibility, which mitigated the workload. But we then also had experts come in to actually run our first year and a half of coaching to prepare our teachers to do the turnaround coaching themselves. So we were building capacity among our teachers to take ownership after the experts came in and demonstrated what those professional learning communities would look like and how that time would be used.
I have to think these policies and programs and strategies are even more effective in schools serving poor students, where we know they struggle to retain high-performing teachers and more experienced teachers. So I want to make sure we have time for the audience. We're about there. Does anyone have a question they would like to raise? And please identify yourself. I think we have one in the back or the middle.
Hello, my name is Warren Morgan. I'm currently serving as a White House Fellow. Prior to this,
Microphone.
Sorry. Hi, my name is Warren Morgan. I'm currently serving as a White House Fellow, and prior to this was a regional soup in Cleveland Public Schools. But my question is, as a leader, sometimes it's challenging with the shifts in accountability systems and the way states as well as districts are actually measuring effectiveness for schools. And I just want to know if you guys have any thoughts of how, from a policy standpoint, we can make accountability systems more equitable, but at the same time give states and districts the autonomy they need to really create what's best for their students.
Back to what Randy was saying about ESSA, it tries to give states that opportunity, and many states have taken good advantage of that and really tried to think about what would make it more equitable. Among other things, paying attention to growth and progress on any of the measures that one takes up is a critically important piece. Developing thoughtful kinds of assessments of English language arts, math, science. Some states are taking advantage of ESSA's invitation to bring performance assessments into the mix of assessments that they use, to spread them throughout the school year so that you can get data along the way, to take up issues like school climate, like reducing suspension rates, you mentioned that earlier, and other.
Get the regulators off of their case. If it forms, then you learn from it and you build from it.
In the red in the back.
My name is Roberta Stanley, and I held various positions in the Michigan Department of Ed, including heading the Office of Teacher Tenure and Teacher Certification. One thing that hasn't been addressed in all these discussions is the partnership between higher ed institutions that actually create the majority of our teachers, and a lot of them are on the cutting edge of really classy and thoughtful education research, and doing partnerships with local school districts to create wonderful professional development. I know we did some of that in Michigan, and I know we produce teachers for the entire United States because we've discovered that other states come to our state to recruit teachers. Would you please address that higher ed component? Thank you.
I'm happy to, but I think I should sit back and let others if they want to.
I like that she referred to education research as classy.
I know. I mean, these are my people she's talking about. I'm so excited, as opposed to wonky. Yeah, I think that, in addition to this conversation was focused on professional development in service, but many schools of education are doing very innovative and informative work. You're from Michigan. I'm sure you're talking in part about University of Michigan and Michigan State. Michigan State. I was about to say Michigan State. I was getting there. Both of which are institutions that are known nationally and internationally for really thoughtful and creative work, creating professional development school relationships, wonderful strategies for training teachers, working on professional development. In fact, some of the studies that we cited in the report, were done through the efforts of educators in those institutions and the researchers that followed the impacts of that work. And that's true in other parts of the country. Like professional development, which gets no RESPECT, teacher education typically also gets little respect, but there are places that are doing really groundbreaking work with strong outcomes. And we need to be encouraging that as well. One of the things about Title II that is interesting is that it really encourages investments in things like teacher residencies and professional practice schools and other strategies that allow for teachers to have a very integrated experience of the credentialing program and a very intensive apprenticeship in schools that comes out of a lot of that work. And those institutions that are stepping up do need to be acknowledged because it is a field like the field of professional learning generally, where you've got a very mixed bag out there and driving towards the light, if you will, driving towards what we know works and holding it up and then using that to inform other practice is really important.
I find that there's a bunch of places in both led by districts and by higher ed institutions that are doing and finding ways to do teacher residencies and integrated within that. And I think that that's one of the most promising practices when done right. And the integration is really beautiful to watch. And so the apprenticeship is real as opposed to, a 2.5 nanosecond student teaching experience. And, and you're seeing places do that. I see SUNY in different parts of New York State is doing it. Michigan State is doing it. There's lots and lots of other places that are, and that has been very promising.
In Maryland, under the leadership of Britt Curran, when he was still chancellor of the university system, we were struggling with elementary mathematics because most of our elementary school teachers were generalists, and we needed them to become more content experts. So as chancellor, he pulled together all the four-year colleges and universities and the community colleges, working with the districts throughout the state of Maryland to look at how we could partner to, number one, look at what certification would be in the future, but now here we are, what can we do to support each other in professional development and learning so that our teachers would be more prepared to go into the classroom. And infusing the new standards was an appropriate time to do it because we already had a compelling reason to be more, to think more conceptually about math and what that looked like, and our teachers needed help with that. So that was a great partnership, and I'm sure that it probably still is today.
And we are taking on a big part of our portfolio has always been this human capital piece, but it's actually growing in the next 2 years, particularly as we get ready for this new class of governors. Next year is a big gubernatorial election year. We'll have 36 elections. And so as we think about preparing for that, this human capital piece continues to come to the forefront of the discussion, along with the accountability systems and equity. Those are two kind of big pieces. And what we're trying to do is states are competitive. Governors do want to see what Governor X over there is doing and how did they become successful. And so we're trying to be very intentional about lifting up those states that are doing this well. A big part of our two-day meeting on human capital was just this piece between the connection to higher ed and what's actually being produced to go back into the classroom. And we had Dr. Steve Tozier come out, who is great, from Chicago, and talk about some of the work that's happening there. But what we're finding is that we not only need to elevate the states and universities or higher ed institutions that are doing this well, but also highlight the conditions that led to that being successful. So those states that aren't doing this well, who don't have an understanding of how to get to point A to even A.5 or B, we can help start framing out what those conditions that led to success, so states can at least get on the pathway to these discussions.
Standing in the back.
Hi, Elizabeth Pancotti from National Council on Teacher Quality. So I know a lot of the conversation has been about what can we do if Title II funding is cut. A lot of the ESSA regs that were Obama era and King era were also just completely cut. So how can, and we talked a lot about how states individually are doing good work or bad work, but how can we make sure that, zooming out, state level equity is maintained under ESSA, because that's the whole point is equity. So how can we make sure that if Tennessee or Michigan or New York or Louisiana are doing good jobs, how can we make sure states that aren't doing good jobs are, because there's no federal policy to mandate equity at higher levels, where states may have those levels in place, but at the federal level there isn't that sort of equity. So how can we maintain that if these regs are cut, if this funding is cut, things like that?
I alluded to earlier the work at Trust around the boot camps. There are 22 states involved in that work, where we're actually going into the states working with policymakers, but also community activists around priorities for their children and on the path of college and career readiness. So because ESSA does give the onus to the states to do this and do it well, we can only support them in their path to college and career readiness for their children in preparation for that. So teaching them how to advocate for policy, teaching them how to use their voice and their vote to compel people to do what is in the best interest for all children. So I think as national organizations, that's what we do. National Governors Association, AFT, CCSSO, other organizations that have state affiliates across the country, is use the knowledge that we bring to the table to help them have stronger voices around this work.
And there are a number of what we call equity nuggets in ESSA that if there are citizens and community groups that are advocating and aware of those, as well as lawyers who are paying attention, states have to report differences in funding. They have to do an equity resource audit of schools that are identified for intervention and correct inequalities or inadequacies that are there. They have to actually even look at how attendance lines are drawn in terms of whether they are unnecessarily segregating, et cetera. So there's a lot baked into the law, and there are some people in the room who had something to do with that, so I just want to acknowledge you for the work that you did on building that law, that if communities are aware and other advocates are aware, will, irrespective of the regulations, be something that can be pursued and attended to.
I think this is an opportunity. Look, Jonah Edelman and I did an op-ed this week coming out against vouchers. You would not have thought before you saw that byline that he and I would have done that together. We did that quite intentionally because this is an opportunity for communities that believe that all children deserve to have their potential unlocked. It's a moment that we the people come together. Sorry to put on my social studies civics hat, teacher civics hat.
Do it.
And that is what, and what I would like to see is the same kind of fight and education that happened when Betsy DeVos's confirmation battle was going on over these issues. And that's why, to Catherine's question before, when somebody said, the Washington answer is, oh, it's dead on arrival, don't worry. Yeah, worry a lot. But this is a matter of, as Linda said, there is enough data points in the new law that if we can get the data tells a story that we can advocate from. But it will need to be groups like EdTrust, various other groups coming together with the unions that represent teachers, the NGA, to actually make that case. Because children don't vote. And we need to make that case on their behalf.
Another piece to that is the National Governors Association, as we start our new launch of work, and we're really positioning ourselves to support this new class of governors, because we know we'll have a minimum of 26 by next year, well, November of next year, how we can provide support. And there's 3 core principles that are going to be baked into all of our work, which we've never really had articulated in this way. One of them is looking at alignment across really prenatal through grade 12 and college and career, looking at equity, and also looking at data-driven decision-making. And as we work with governors and their offices, our job, our fundamental responsibility is to bring to them research and best practices. And we're talking about policymakers who may not necessarily have the depth or content or understanding of what these pieces mean. And when you take a term like equity, even though there's language in the laws, their concept of what that means varies so widely. And so one of the things we're hoping to do is really raise this equity discussion so that it is at the forefront of every state conversation that we go into, because education is fundamentally, it is an equity issue. And the outcomes for young children depend on what their access is. And another piece that we did to really be intentional is we recognize that on a state level, to really make policy change, you have to work closely with the chief state school officer and the governor. And so we worked very closely with CCSSO to understand their language, their framing, their approach, not so that we could mirror it, but so we can be an equal partner, so that when we go into a state and we're talking about equity, we can have similar terminology that hopefully will ring bells and show that alignment across national organizations. Because when you say equity to one person, it means something very different. Like for me, I'll push back a little bit. To me, equity isn't everything for every child, because every child needs something different. When we talk about equity, it's making sure that every child has the right outcome or has the opportunity for that outcome regardless of their start point. Because my start point was very different, I'm sure, than anybody else on this panel. So getting what everybody else got may not have worked for me. And so we really need to be very clear as to how we're articulating equity and how are we connecting it amongst educational partners, so that dosage, how many times do people need to hear things until it really rings true, so that they're hearing the same message regardless of constituents. And that's when we'll really start to push this equity envelope.
I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions. Does anyone else have a question? Oh, we've exhausted all the questions. Fantastic. Oh. Yes. So we can listen to it again. Yes, absolutely. I would just underscore what the panelists said as well. I think one of the most important provisions in Title I remains that children in Title I schools cannot be taught at a disproportionate rate by ineffective and inexperienced teachers. And this has been law for a long time, but it continues to be an incredibly important driver of equity, and to the extent that states can take this on and make it real. And I think the entire conversation today really underscores how critical that provision is and how much promise it has to level the playing field for poor children. So I really want to thank our wonderful panelists today and everyone else for coming.